Welcome to the DiCOTA Magazine Show, the premier talk show where we celebrate diversity, equity, and inclusion in business, leadership, and innovation. Each episode will introduce you to influential leaders from all sectors, ethnicities, and backgrounds. We'll share with you the story behind their story of how they made it, and you can too. I'm your host, Cedric Fisher, 40-year career journalist and publisher of DiCOTA Magazine. Welcome to the DiCOTA Magazine Show. I'm your host, Cedric Fisher. And today we're honored to have a special guest on the show. We're honored to have Mr. Arthur Poore with us. Art is a veteran of the United States Armed Forces and a veteran law enforcement officer. His desire is to impact his audience to such a degree that every person from student to warrior will leave empowered, focused, and peaceful. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Arthur Poore. Welcome to the show, Art.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Got a series of questions here. So before we begin talking about that, just share with us your background, where you're from, and by now folks have gathered that you're Native American. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I'm born and raised here in San Antonio on the northwest side, back when Marbach Road was small subdivision with a bunch of wooded areas, before it is what it is now today. I come from Apache and Hispanic ancestry. And for the most part, I've just been, just a kid from the city here, joined the military when I was 18. Because during that time, my parents didn't have any money for college. And that was really my only way out of trying to establish a career for myself. Got out of that, and during that time, as a soldier, I really didn't have any skills. I didn't have any education. I didn't have a degree, and that was the only trade that I had was soldiering. And the only profession that really respected that and desired those skill set was law enforcement. And it wasn't my first choice, but that was the only skills I had.
Kind of a natural transition with the skill sets, right?
Yes, sir.
Sure.
And so I took advantage of that, and the career's been very, very good to me. God's blessed me tremendously through that, and now it's kind of led me to this different transition in life that I hopefully to make,
Yeah. So what was the moment you decided you wanted to go in law enforcement? You were retiring from the military and just needed some options?
It was, I had got injured in OEF 5, and, I'd spent a lot of time in different hospitals in Landstuhl, Germany, and then finally came down to BAMC, and was healthy enough to leave. Doctors there told me, you won't be in any type of physical type of job because, you can't run, anymore. And so it took me a long time of rehab, of running out at Woodlawn Lake. So those of you that have been out to Woodlawn Lake, you know what I'm talking about.
Okay, sure.
During, all kinds of inclement weather, but just to get healthy and try to propel myself to that level. And that's where the military training came in, that mindset, and helped me move forward and got me into law enforcement, successfully.
What exactly, from the beginning of your career in law enforcement to what you do now, what has been your premier focus?
Again, I was really blessed to be an instructor for a law enforcement academy at a very young age. I went to school, I took advantage of my GI Bill, went to school, got a degree, and was able to promote into a supervisory position. And now, I guess the biggest transition was the moment my mother-in-law was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And so I spent tons of hours in the hospital. She'd love for me to read and tell her stories. At that time, I was working on my master's in divinity, just because I just wanted a better understanding of my own faith, Yeah. But it gave me, I had a very wonderful professor, Dr. David Maltzberger, who kind of opened my eyes to a lot of different things. And if he's watching this, I apologize because I was writing the book kind of in class with you during those times. But it was really during that time that I actually put aside law enforcement and started kind of looking at some of the bigger issues that are going on in the world. And that kind of all started with the diagnosis of cancer with my mother-in-law. And then coming up with formulating stories to kind of help her through her times when she was receiving chemo, or the times we'd have to take her to the doctor because, her health started failing depending on what procedure she had at that time. So that kind of put me in a sense where I was used to protecting the nation, and protecting our community. And I felt that just wasn't enough. I felt my reach just wasn't enough, because there was so much other suffering happening. Where if you're a victim of crime, I can help. But if you're a victim of cancer, if you're a victim of depression, if you're a victim of, trauma, domestic violence, how could I help you at that level, And I'm not a counselor, but I know stories have always helped individuals. And I believe, and I truly believe, that that's kind of what helped my mother. And she had told me, hey, write a book about this. And I said, oh, Mom, I'll write a book. And then I promised her I would. So I made good on that promise 2 years after she had passed. So it was in 2 years of production, basically.
And the book is called?
Adin Elijah and the Medallion of Destiny. The title really is, when my wife was pregnant, she was pregnant during the time my mother-in-law was, suffering from cancer. And so my youngest son, his name is Adin Elijah. And so he kind of was the premise for the book, the hero of the book, because in my mind, he was this child that wasn't able to ever meet his grandmother, So he was already at a disadvantage, in my opinion,
Yeah.
And my wife, too, she was suffering as well because she was pregnant, still having to deal with her mother, passing from cancer. So that was the title of the book. And Medallion of Destiny was one of those things where it resembles a Catholic rosary, where in the Catholic faith, the rosary is what you use, much like in Native American ceremonies, the feather is what you'll use to pray. And so in my mind, it clicked where the rosary or the feather or whatever faith you belong to, there's always some type of medallion, there's some type of symbolism that you have that kind of reconnects you to that particular faith. So that's kind of where the title came from. And long story short, it's basically about a child who's an orphan who discovers that he's from a celestial parent and from a mortal parent, that celestial parent being what we would refer to as angelos in the Greek, which is an angel. But in the book, during much research, it's more of a guardian that they're described in biblical theology.
It's an AV king.
The AV king, the AV stands for Arthur the Victorious King.
Okay.
So that's kind of what me and my wife came up together, and we thought it was kind of a catchy phrase. And we never thought that it would kind of catch the fire that it kind of did, Yeah. But I was very confident with that. And it's one of those, where, like in my cultural beliefs, you sometimes have different names.
Yeah.
In some Native American nations, you'll transition from name to name. And it's the same here in the Western world, where you can go from brother to father, to uncle. These are different titles that you start assuming throughout your life, or the transitions in your life. And that's kind of what this transition was for me as far as a pen name.
Are there any major events in your life and experiences that kind of led you to the work that you're currently doing?
I started realizing that everybody's purpose, everybody's power is sometimes buried or layered under trauma. It's sometimes layered under those things that we experience. And we get so comfortable in life that we never really strip away those things to really see what our true potential is, or our true purpose is, And I started stripping away those things for myself. As a kid, I was always told, you should be a writer. And I was like, man, that's not macho, Nobody writing, what are you talking about? And I'd have teachers in grade school that would kind of submit my poetry and some stories, to certain, applications where young writers, and they would tell me all the time, hey, you need to do it again. And I would pin out something, and they were like, that's not your best work, And then all my life, everyone always referred to me as author. And I was like, well, my name is Arthur, but they would call me author,
Okay.
So it was just kind of, and things just started clicking as I got older, and is that when that moment with my mother passing, that really was the 360 for me. So that kind of, sums it up, I guess.
Okay, good. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about your current work in law enforcement.
Okay, great.
We'll be right back.
What is Influence DiCOTA? Influence DiCOTA simply means promoting or influencing diversity and communities through opportunities, technologies, and amenities. These are key areas for building and securing a future global society. And who wouldn't want that? Influence DiCOTA can offer specific solutions to the actual challenges facing diversity and inclusion within today's marketplace. With the right mix of diversity and inclusion practices, shared missions, and common sense and values, we can reach our global diversity goals and build a future that's truly global in scope. Influence DiCOTA, offering competitive, compelling, comprehensive coverage that address the actual needs of today's consumers, communities, and commerce. Join the movement now.
Welcome back to the Influence DiCOTA Show. We're here today with Arthur Poore, also known as AV King. Welcome back to the show, Arthur. So when we left for break, we were going to talk a little bit about your current work in law enforcement.
Okay.
And being an instructor. And offline, you and I have talked in the past about some of the racial issues and police brutality issues that are going on. Just kind of share with our audience a little bit about your current work as an instructor at the Academy and how you address those topics.
I can't name the Academy because obviously I don't have their permission right now, but I've been teaching for roughly since 2008. And I've taught firearms, defensive tactics, penal code, basically all the facets of the law enforcement academy criterion. And a lot in that criterion involves police history. You know, we talk about where, you know, corruption's first identified in police and how we've created laws, and there's constitutional law now that address those things. But one of my biggest facets whenever I'm teaching is I always bring in a big cultural sense to it. And what I mean by that is, for instance, and if some of my students see this interview, they'll agree with you, or excuse me, with me, where the people, you know, in the native way, the people are your community. They're the people, and you're not really single out from the people. Everything you do is for the people, you know. For instance, like being a warrior, it's not just about fighting. It's also about what are you creating, what art, what poetry, what music, how are you helping your elderly, how are you raising your family, you know. That's what encompasses being a warrior. So when I'm talking or I'm teaching to, you know, cadets, I try to install this tribal mentality where the community are your people, no matter what they look like, what language they speak, no matter, you know, what their ethnicity or religious beliefs or political beliefs are, those are your people, you know. And I always close with, you are guardians of the state and her people, you know. You are not this singular entity by yourself, because everything you do is for the people. Like when you arrest somebody, it doesn't say, you know, Officer Poore against the state. This person has violated something against the state, against the people, you know.
Sure.
So that's one of the biggest facets that I always push is you are for the people. Everything you do as a police officer is for the people. We're stopping you running a red light because we're trying to protect the rest of the people and you know. That's kind of the mentality that we try pushing. And then I also bring in, you know, the historical contexts, you know, of policing. Yeah. You know, like one of my biggest questions is, you know, who would have ever thought? I usually open up with this: who would have ever thought? They looked at the black man as the slave, and they looked at the red man as the savage. And I said, and we would hold hands running around in the forest, you know. And you would see the kind of the shock that some of the students have, because it was very, very true. During colonial policeism, you know, where all men are created equal, well, you know, the red man or the Indian, you know, and the black man or the slave wasn't equal. And we all know that, you know. And now you kind of see this big transition where, you know, law enforcement is trying to encompass, you know, the cultural norms, you know, and different races. But the problem is how do you relate to that, you know? My draw to law enforcement was because it was a paramilitary organization. I understood that. I made that connection, you know. But for the most part, you know, I never saw really Hispanic police officers or black police officers or even Native American police officers, you know. And then again, it was just a skill set that I already had that kind of propelled me into that position. But going back to the cadet, you know, there's not one instance where, you know, you will find in a police academy or even instructors that I've been around like, well, we need to treat a particular race this way. You know what I mean? But with that, there's also the humanity side where, police officers, and I tell people this all the time, our objective is to deal with the worst that society has to offer. And at some certain point in an individual psychosis, something's going to change, I used to tell my wife all the time, please don't ask me about work.
Yeah.
Don't. She was like, why? Why not? Because I don't want to relive some of those things. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to relive some of that trauma or some of those horrible things, or having to do, having to visit violence upon somebody. I don't want to relive that,
Right.
And that's kind of sometimes what happens with a police officer, through everything that we saw going on around the nation. You really didn't hear a police officer talking because you really won't. Because again, like a soldier who's gone off to battle, unless he's among other soldiers, he's not going to tell you the realities of warfare.
Right.
He's not going to tell you the realities of what human beings. A police officer won't sit there, during breakfast or lunch and say, hey, by the way, I saw this horrible accident. They're not going to tell you that. They kind of keep it all bottled up inside. And they only talk about each other because they won't be judged by other police officers. And so when everything started going around the nation and what was breaking down, I completely understand. Because I saw those things overseas.
Sure.
And I think the biggest caveat is we have forgotten, in my opinion, as police officers, and this goes all the way up to the chain of command, all the way up to the chief of police, city council, goes all the way up to those levels where the community wants police officers to, sit and talk with, let's say, having lunch at gyms, having a cup of coffee. But the hierarchy and the law enforcement chain of command says, hey, you're committing waste, fraud, and abuse by talking to this person. You're on a call. You should be patrolling the streets. So there's a disconnect between the community and the police officer. And it's not because of the police officer's lack of wanting to interact with the public. It's because now we are dealing with things that are put now at executive levels. And I tell cadets all the time, you are entering in a world where law enforcement has never had to deal with terrorism. They never had to deal with mental health. They've always had to deal with the worst crimes.
Sure.
And now we see things that are changing drastically. And how do you prepare somebody in an academy for 6 months to deal with counterterrorism, to deal with some of the drugs that are coming out that are turning people psychotic, to deal with a bunch of people now that we're starting to realize now our community just, some of the mental health issues facing our community. And then on top of that, throw every law that the state of Texas has, throw constitutional law, all that in 6 months. It's overwhelming for some people.
Yeah. Right.
And I usually close with, why would you want to do a job where you can be sued for doing the right thing?
Interesting question.
And I ask them that because I tell them, listen, Shakespeare said it the best, to thy own self be true. Make sure that this is a calling. This has to be a calling, but in the very fibers of your soul that you are a protector of the community because you're willing to give your life for the community. But if you're here because you want the badge and the gun and you like the uniform, then you're going to be one of those statistics in law enforcement that we talk about here in the academy. Kind of like the incidents that we're seeing with George Floyd.
Yeah.
You're going to start seeing those. You're going to be one of those statistics, and you're going to see how it rocks the nation, not just the nation, the world. When we have, as a nation, when we went to war with different countries and different ethnicities, the American public started treating those different ethnicities quite differently. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And you can see that historically. With the Japanese, you can see with the Native Americans, especially the first was my people, the Native Americans. You saw the public treated us very, very differently. And I think what happens at the level of the individual officer when they're dealing within a community, for instance, like I was trained on the east side. Mm-hmm. So I understand how a lot of the families and a lot of the community thinks there. Now, if you were to implant me to train on 1604 and Stone Oak, well, I don't understand that community at all because I wasn't raised in that particular community or that social climate, I understand the pleasantries of sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, you know what I mean? But I wouldn't understand really how would I deal with if I pulled somebody over in a $100,000 car, and that person won't be physically, rebellious, but they may be verbally. Why are you pulling me over? What's the law? How do you know I was doing this? Where now the officer has to take a step back and say, okay, wait a minute, now we're having an intellectual discussion here, you know, and the person may say, hey, I'm not being violent with you, I'm not resisting, but I'm asking you all these questions. And you'll see tons of YouTube videos where officers are kind of caught off guard with that, you know, which again is a caveat back to the academy, where know your law, know exactly why you're doing what you're doing. Then you get to, let's say, the east side or the west side, you know, where now you're starting to talk, when you're talking to mom, you're talking to the whole family, the matriarch of the family, you know, versus talking to an individual, you know. And I found that because I understood that cultural and social environment, that if I explained to the family this is what's happening to this family member because of this issue, then they were more in agreement with me versus me saying, I don't need to talk to you, I need to talk to him and I'm gonna deal with him or her. And now you have all these questions. And now that those questions open doors to, is this officer being racist? Is this the officer targeting just my family member or my skin color? Because there's no interaction. Because in the officer's mind is, I need to clear this call and move on to the next, or there's 4 other calls holding, you know? And because that's, again, the hierarchy that puts that burden on the officer, you know? I've even shown up to calls where I've had to say, listen, you know, I'm trying to clear this because there's a rape going on, or there's a code 3 response, and I'm one of the next available officers that's closest to that incident, you know. So you have all these dynamics in place that kind of shake out. But as far as brutality, the military does an excellent job of, when you leave a war zone, where, in my opinion, at least in my experience, where you sit down and you have to talk to a bunch of counselors, you know. In law enforcement, you don't talk to a counselor until something major happens, you know. So there's a lot of reform that, and we and you talked offline about this, you know, that I'm more than willing to share with the department heads as well as, you know, members of our political committee, you know. But in particular, George Floyd, I can tell you right now, in the academy, teaching the academy as long as I have, there's not one tactic that we ever teach to do something like that, where you put your knee on the back of an assailant or a suspect's neck, especially someone that's restrained. And there's so many other questions as an instructor that I would ask during that particular incident, especially I pull him out of the car and all these other things that happen. There's so many finite details that the public's just not aware about, you know, that I would ask as an instructor, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? You know. But as far as that tactic, I can guarantee you someone taught him that.
Yeah.
Or that was a tactic that's been exclusively accepted in that department. You know, and I can tell by his demeanor that he doesn't realize he's doing something wrong. You know what I mean? And the other officers around too may have questioned because they had some prior training that kind of raised a red flag. Hey, can this guy breathe? But for the most part, it looks like that's a tactic that's widely accepted in that department, or something that's maybe taught by somebody, which is again falls back on the instructor, which, you know, we kind of brought up, was if you don't portray to the cadet that the people's best interest, even restraining yourself from using force, is in the best interest of the people, then you will have incidents like the George Floyd and several other incidents throughout, you know, the nation that we've seen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
And all sorts of training.
So that was not a trained tactic or taught?
It's not a trained tactic, what I call Southern policing.
Yeah, the knee on the neck.
That we train like that. And even in the federal circle, where I've had the privilege of training the National Park Service, where we've ever, not even at the federal level, have we ever discussed or demonstrated techniques on doing that, you know? Especially someone that's restrained.
Sure.
Especially someone that you may have some inclination that they may have some intoxicants in their system, whether it's alcohol or narcotic, you know? Which is, again, falls back to training, is should the officer be able to identify that this person is acting erratically or not acting normal, which would leave the officer to believe, is there some type of intoxicant, or is this organic? Is this a mental health issue? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So there's that. So it's a lot of training. You can throw cultural diversity all day long at somebody. So now change up the environment and give somebody that may be under mental health issues along with illegal narcotics in their system, and now they're behaving violently because of the altered psychosis.
Wow. Okay.
And now deal with that systematically. And on top of that, you work in this big box of constitutional law and use of force. you know. So things can go very dynamic very, very quickly, you know, as we've seen around the nation. But for the most part, and I can attest, at least in the training that I've given and that I've seen, observed, is that's not a tactic that we teach.
Okay. Let's talk about the book again, Adin Elijah. What impact do you hope that it has on young readers?
Well, I hope it has a global impact. And what my heart's desire is that whoever reads that book, you know, that's suffering from bullying or going through some type of trauma, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, you know, all the things that a young person experiences, and we were both young at one time, you know, all the things that we see on the outside, I'm hoping that that book will help someone discover their power, you know, help them discover that purpose, help them to strip away those things that is buried underneath. Drugs, alcohol, you know, absentee parents, you know, death of parents, you know, losing a loved one to cancer, you know, family member to cancer, helping that young reader strip away all those things to discover their purpose and their power, you know. That's what I'm hoping that the global impact is. And for the adult reader, if the adult picks one up, they're going to realize that those characters, they're going to be able to identify with characters that make mistakes. But then you see these adult characters figure out, well, how can I fix this mistake I made in the very beginning? How do I fix it now in the present time? Because there's always an opportunity to fix something, you know. And there's always an opportunity for that young reader, if they're, for instance, I'll give you an example, an absentee father, where now their father comes back in their adult life, well, there's an opportunity to fix something there, you know, to strip away that trauma of absenteeism, you know. So that's what I'm hoping that all young readers, and I put a lot of strong female characters in there, because I've always wanted a daughter, and God's blessed me with nothing but boys, but you know, I put very strong female characters in there as well that supplement our hero, you know, strong female characters that are adults as well, you know, and that falls back to the old Iroquois nation, where the nation was governed by females.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and how a mother is an elderly woman is grandmother to all, or your mother is mother to all, because they're people, you know.
Yeah.
So I kind of brought some of those tribal aspects into the book, you know. So that's what I'm hoping my reader will be not only encouraged, you know, with purpose and power, but also see that there's different cultures. I put a bunch of different cultures in there as well, cultures that I have personal experience with, you know.
Yeah.
And that I respect tremendously. Asian cultures, the African culture, you know, Native culture, you know, Western culture. So hopefully I put enough characters in there that the reader will be able to identify with, you know, as well. Because I wanted to bring, you know, honor to those cultures as well. Because they've been tremendous influences on my life as well, you know.
Yeah.
And I have a bunch of friends of different ethnicities, you know, different races, you know, that have made impacts in my life. And that I'm glad to call friends. Well, actually brothers more. And sisters.
Good, absolutely. Some final questions for you here. What's your view or opinion of the future of policing?
Well, I would say the future of policing is going to have to require not only the civilian populace helping out, but you're going to have to organize or identify those particular officers that have an understanding of community. Well, again, what I reference as tribal policing, tribal community, understanding that what we're doing is for the people. You know, and those are going to be very, very few and hard to find, you know, which is why I kind of throw myself out there as saying, hey, look, I can help you identify those people, you know. But as far as the future of policing, if we can nail down that, I think you'll see a very different change in the next 30 years of how policing and the community are going to respond to.
Yeah. We have the privilege of obviously interviewing very influential leaders. Most leaders are readers, and you'll typically find their go-to book on their nightstand. What book is on your nightstand?
To be quite honest with you, it's actually my book.
Okay.
Because that's my dream, is seeing this book grow globally, is impacting, you know, catching Hollywood's attention to come to our city and recruit from our city, you know, and our youth and our adults and our professionals here. that's kind of why that's on my nightstand. You know, so every time I roll over and I wake up in the morning, there's my dream.
That's what you see.
That's
Your
what I
dream.
see.
Outstanding. Final question, and that really is your opportunity to ask our audience, how can folks support you or get in touch with you should they have a question about the book itself, or maybe even law enforcement?
Well, I have, they can reach me at your publishing, Cedric Fisher's Publishing,
Okay.
avkingauthor at yahoo.com. I have an Instagram account as well, so you can pretty much reach me on those mediums, if not through you exclusively.
Page?
Yeah, Facebook page as well. Yeah,
Sure.
that's right.
Okay.
So yeah, if you Google AV King, all kinds of stuff will pop up, and I love to respond too. So I never feel overwhelmed, and I try to sometimes I'll be up at 4 a.m. responding, you know, to any questions that some parents have or some people have, or you know, even opportunities to speak, to be a keynote speaker as well. You know, so.
Sure. Thank you for coming on the show today. This has been very enlightening.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you all next time.